Autumn 1221. The turbulent currents of the Indus River crash against the jagged rocks with a deafening roar, drowning out the violent clash of steel and the desperate screams of the dying. On the high riverbank, pinned against a deep abyss, the last hope of the Islamic world is perishing. The enemy encirclement has finally and completely closed. Mongol archers draw their bowstrings back, preparing to permanently seal the fate of the once great Khwarazmian Empire. Suddenly, a lone horseman breaks through the ranks of the doomed defenders. Clad in heavy armor, battered and scarred but utterly unbroken, he casts off his pierced helmet. Turning to face the advancing steel avalanche, the warrior steers his exhausted steed straight toward the edge of a 7-meter cliff. One desperate leap into the boiling abyss, and the rider disappears into the churning whirlpools, leaving his pursuers frozen in silent stupor. On the edge of the precipice, the figure of the conqueror of the universe himself appears. Genghis Khan, whose generals had recently ground half of Asia into dust, freezes in his tracks. The Lord of the East raises his hand, halting the deadly hail of arrows ready to be unleashed. Following the fugitive with his gaze, watching a man who had just defied death itself, the conqueror acknowledges the sheer greatness of this enemy with words that would later echo across the pages of history. The name of this man was Jalal al-Din Mangburni, the last heir of a collapsed state. Previously, we saw how the boundless greed of the governor in Otrar awakened the Mongol dragon. Before our very eyes, Sultan Muhammad II lost his mind, abandoning a 400,000-strong army to die an inglorious death on a desolate Caspian island. We also know of the treacherous plots of the Serpent Queen, Terken Khatun, who doomed her own country for the sake of absolute power. But while Timur Malik was building his river ironclads on the Sir Darya, Jalal al-Din chose the path of relentless resistance in the open field. In this episode, you will follow in the footsteps of the outcast prince who assembled roaring legions from ashes. You are about to witness the unthinkable. It is this very warrior who will inflict the first crushing defeat upon the elite Mongol tumens, shattering the myth of the invincible demons of the steppe. Before your eyes, a grand story will unfold. How a cornered lone wolf made kings and sultans tremble in fear, forging his own sheer desperation into the most terrifying weapon of the 13th century. But right here lies the greatest historical mystery. How did a master strategist who survived global meat grinders and commanded the genuine admiration of the great Khan himself end his journey in utter obscurity in the mountains of Kurdistan? Why was a sovereign who effortlessly evaded volleys of Mongol arrows stabbed to death by a nameless bandit for a worn-out kaftan? What fatal mistake transformed the sole savior of the East into the sworn enemy of the entire inhabited world? The truth hides deep within the luxurious palaces of doomed Khwarazm, where a prince stripped of his own family's support realized for the very first time the only thing you can truly rely on is your own blade. The name Mangburni translates from Turkic rather prosaically, with a mole on his nose. However, his contemporaries hailed the eldest son of the Khwarazm Shah differently. They called him Mingirini, a warrior equal to 1,000 men. The firstborn, a brilliant tactician, a fearless leader capable of inspiring an army to follow him to the very edge of the earth. According to all the laws of logic, it was he who was destined to inherit the greatest Islamic empire of the 13th century. But In the gloomy, whispering corridors of Gurganj, logic readily gave way to ruthless intrigue, and personal talents were valued far lower than the purity of one's bloodline. The root of Jalal al-Din's troubles lay in his mother's lineage. Aychichek was merely a common Turkmen concubine. For the prince's domineering grandmother, the serpent queen Terken Khatun, this fact was an unbearable insult. The matriarch of Khwarazm, who belonged to the highest echelons of Kipchak aristocracy, relied heavily on the swords of her tribesmen. She simply could not physically tolerate the idea that the golden throne would be occupied by a half-blood grandson, a man entirely alien to her powerful clan. Exploiting her boundless influence over her weak-willed son, Sultan Muhammad II, Terken Khatun commits an act of outright dynastic suicide. She forces the ruler to publicly humiliate Jalal al-Din and strip him of his status as the rightful heir. The fate of the entire empire is blindly handed over to his younger brother, Uzlag Shah, a youth completely devoid of talent or willpower, but who happened to be half Kipchak. For Jalal al-Din, this served as his very first lesson in the brutal nature of politics. The prince came to a stark realization: the enemy doesn't always come from the outside with a drawn blade. Most often, they smile treacherously right across the family dining table. The autumn of 1219 ruthlessly exposes the fatal consequences of this disastrous decision. On the horizon, the steel avalanche of Genghis Khan rises. The Khwarazmian army fields a colossal army of 400,000 sabers, and Jalal al-Din begs his father not to make a fatal, irredeemable mistake. The prince urgently calls to consolidate their forces into a single mighty fist for a grand, decisive battle on the banks of the Sir Darya. He desperately wants to personally lead the vanguard and throw the Mongols into the river before they even have a chance to deploy their formations. However, Muhammad is paralyzed by an overwhelming fear. The Sultan fears not so much the Mongols, but rather his own Kipchak generals, who remain fiercely loyal to Terken Khatun. The ruler outright rejects his brilliant plan and fractures the giant army, locking his regiments inside isolated fortresses. Jalal al-Din is forced to watch helplessly as his homeland crumbles into dust. The tactical genius rides in the retinue of his cowardly father, retreating further and further south, while Genghis Khan, methodically, like a surgeon with a scalpel, carves out one city after another. The winter of 1220 puts an end to the life of Sultan Muhammad. The broken monarch, ravaged by pneumonia, dies in a filthy shirt on a for-God-saken forgotten island in the middle of the Caspian Sea. Right before the very end, finally grasping the true scale of the catastrophe, he summons his deeply despised eldest son. The Khwarazm Shah hands Jalal al-Din his sword, a symbol of power that is already fractured and crumbling, and the title of Sultan, entrusting him with the impossible task of saving what can no longer be saved. The young ruler wastes no time on grief. He breaks through to the capital, Gurganj, desperately hoping to lead its 90,000-strong garrison. However, waiting for him there is a betrayal far more terrifying than Mongol arrows. Even in the face of the approaching apocalypse, the Kipchak elite entirely refuses to recognize the authority of the sarcastic concubine's son. The local military commanders do not merely sabotage his direct orders, they meticulously orchestrate a nighttime assassination attempt against the new sultan. The very city he came to fiercely defend greets him with drawn blades of conspirators. Realizing that the capital has become a deadly trap, Jalal al-Din makes the only correct decision. Under the thick cover of darkness, he abandons Gurganj, taking with him only a tiny handful of fiercely loyal men, mere 300 riders. just assess the true scale of this catastrophe. Yesterday's heir to a global superpower has lost absolutely everything. There is no country, no royal treasury, no multi-thousand-strong army. Breathing down his neck is the burning hatred of traitorous generals, while right on his heels, tearing up the steppe with their hooves, races the relentless Mongol vanguard. Where is an outcast prince to run? And exactly how is a squad of 300 men supposed to challenge an empire that just crushed half the world? 300 exhausted riders dissolve into the shimmering mirages of the Karakum Desert. Behind their backs, a once great empire is burning to the ground. Gurganj, the majestic capital of their homeland, is drowning in rivers of blood. Sultan Muhammad II, the former master of half the world, has already ended his days in sheer poverty on a Caspian island. And the domineering grandmother, Terken Khatun, who sacrificed the entire nation for her personal ambitions, is trudging in heavy shackles into Mongol exile. Jalal al-Din, entirely stripped of his throne, his treasury, and his grand army, undertakes a grueling march that would have shattered any other man. 16 days of merciless, blistering heat, agonizing thirst, and constant bloody skirmishes with Mongol patrols. Upon reaching the border with Afghanistan, the prince suddenly delivers a devastating strike. With just his tiny handful of men, he slaughters an entire Mongol patrol near the city of Nesa. This small, seemingly insignificant victory triggers a chain reaction of unimaginable power. The rumor that the rightful heir is still alive and actively crushing the riders of the steppe spreads across Asia faster than a wildfire. Jalal al-Din arrives in Ghazni, a major, bustling city in the territory of modern Afghanistan. And here, a genuine historical miracle occurs. The sheer charisma of this man and his iron will transform him into a powerful magnet for all the survivors. The shattered remnants of Khwarazmian garrisons flock to his side. The fierce, battle-hardened Afghan Highlanders of Saif el-Din Igrak proudly rally under his banners. The ranks are further swelled by the prince's own father-in-law, Amin al-Malik, who brings with him tens of thousands of deadly Turkic sabers. In just a few short months, the outcast, who possessed nothing but his father's broken sword, gathers a massive army. Persian chroniclers cite numbers ranging from 60,000 to 120,000 men. This motley, ragtag host, consisting half of foot soldiers, hardly resembled a regular imperial guard, but it was welded tight by a shared, burning thirst for vengeance. Tidings of the miraculous rebirth of Khwarazmian power soon reach Genghis Khan. The conqueror of the universe is currently tied down by a grueling, heavy siege in the treacherous mountains of the Hindu Kush. He cannot simply abandon his main forces, but he resolves to crush this upstart using someone else's hands. Genghis Khan dispatches his own stepbrother to the south, the supreme judge of the empire, Shiki Kutuku. Under his direct command are 30,000 elite cavalrymen, a terrifying force that had hitherto never known a single defeat. Shiki Kutuku had already proven himself to be a brilliant administrator and a remarkably brave warrior, but he suffered from the exact same crippling affliction as many Mongol generals of that era: absolute, blind overconfidence. He was accustomed to driving the enemy before him like a helpless flock of sheep. Autumn 1221. The two massive armies clash near the city of Parwan, within a narrow rocky valley north of Kabul. And it is right here that Jalal al-Din fully demonstrates his outstanding tactical genius. The Mongol army is the absolute perfect machine for maneuvering warfare. Their element is the endless open steppe, where they can effortlessly envelop the enemy in a crescent, drown them in a hail of arrows, and exhaust them with endless feigned retreats. But the prince violently forces them into a battle inside a tight, rocky cage. The mountains of Parwan physically prevent the Mongol cavalry from deploying their formations. When the massive battle begins, the commander issues an order that completely shatters all the established templates of Eastern warfare. He forces his mounted archers to dismount. Standing firmly on solid ground, the Khwarazmians gain a colossal, overwhelming advantage in shooting accuracy. Jalal al-Din explicitly orders them, do not aim at the riders, but specifically at their horses. The valley echoes with the frantic, agonizing neighing of falling steeds. Without a horse, a warrior clad in heavy armor on a steep mountain slope instantly turns into a clumsy, sitting target. For the entirety of the first day, Shiki Kutuku throws his elite tumens at the prince's unyielding positions, and all day long they roll back, washing the rocks in their own blood. Light eventually falls. The Mongol leader fully realizes that brute force will never break the Khwarazmians, and he resorts to a cunning psychological trick designed to completely crush the enemy's spirit. Shiki Kutuku orders his men to gather every spare saddle and felt they have. Under the cover of darkness, his men bind together thousands of realistic straw and rag dummies, placing them firmly on their remounts. At the break of dawn, absolute panic erupts in the Khwaraz Shah's camp. The morning mist slowly dissipates, and the terrified warriors see that the enemy host on the horizon has miraculously doubled in size. The Afghan chieftains, struck by profound terror, demand an immediate retreat. They are absolutely certain that fresh tumens, led by Genghis Khan himself, have arrived to reinforce the enemy. Any other man would have faltered. But Jalal al-Din personally rides out in front of his trembling ranks. He carefully peers into the enemy lines and completely unravels the core of the deception. The prince slowly rides along his troops, forcefully restoring their shattered faith in themselves. The grand Mongol illusion fails miserably. On the third day, Jalal al-Din ruthlessly goes on the offensive. Leaving his dismounted archers to cover the flanks, he personally leads the charge of the heavy cavalry. The ferocious roar of battle trumpets tears through the air, and the Khwarazmian wedge violently rips open the very center of the Mongol formation. This wasn't merely a tactical maneuver. This was the concentrated, explosive wrath of a nation that had lost its home. Shiki Kutuku's elite army is utterly shattered. The nomads of the steppe finally break and turn into a chaotic flight. The vengeful victors pursue them mercilessly on their heels. More than half of the 30,000-strong elite corps remain dead in the gorges of Parwan. Contemporaries grimly recorded that the vindictive victors drove wooden stakes into the ears of their captive enemies. The entire scale of this monumental event is difficult to overstate. During the lifetime of Genghis Khan, at the absolute zenith of his glory, this became the very first and only crushing defeat of the Mongols in an open field. The terrifying myth of their invincibility was smashed into a million pieces. The roaring echo of the Parwan triumph rolled like thunder across the entirety of Asia. Upon hearing of this great victory, Merv, Herat, and Bukhara immediately rose in bloody rebellion, overthrowing their Mongol governors. It genuinely seemed as though the wheel of history had just been violently reversed. But on that very same evening, when Jalal al-Din should have been joyously celebrating his monumental success, his fatal weakness was laid bare. He remained an absolute god on the battlefield, but proved to be a complete bankrupt in politics. The victor's camp is bursting with vast spoils, fine Mongol armor, heavy gold, and thousands of captured horses. During the division of the grand trophies, the gaze of Saif el-Iraq and Timur Malik, the legendary hero of our previous episode, falls on the exact same steed. It is a magnificent, pure white Arabian stallion, captured from a high-ranking Mongol officer. A petty verbal dispute over the horse instantly escalates into a massive, explosive conflict between two gigantic egos. The hot-tempered Timur Malik, utterly blinded by his own pride, raises his heavy whip and strikes Iraq violently across the face. Thus, yesterday's glorious hero of the defense of Khujand becomes the direct instrument of the destruction of the entire coalition. The heavy, suffocating silence that hung over the glittering trophies seemed far more terrifying than the deafening roar of battle that had just died down. The fierce leader of the Afghans, blood slowly dripping from his face, turned to look at the prince. He demanded justice. He demanded a harsh punishment for Timur Malik for blatantly insulting an invaluable ally whose very men had secured this great victory. But Jalal al-Din remained utterly silent. Whether out of misplaced familial loyalty or terrified of losing his father-in-law's heavy cavalry, he did not utter a single word. The grievous insult was left completely unpunished. That very night, Saif el-Iraq ordered his furious men to pack up their tents. Tens of thousands of battle-hardened Afghan warriors, who made up nearly half of the entire army, silently vanished into the dark mountains. Because of one single white horse and a ruler's absolute inability to mediate internal conflicts, the army that had just shattered the Mongols disintegrated into dust. Jalal al-Din woke up the next morning, a triumphant victor who had lost all his power. Meanwhile, far to the north, standing right on the site of the recent battle, among the rotting corpses of his own warriors, was Genghis Khan himself. The conqueror of the universe had personally arrived in Parwan to inspect the site of the sheer catastrophe. He didn't scream. He simply, methodically explained to the surviving Shigi Kotuku all his fatal mistakes right over the bodies of the dead. Jalal al-Din had fully awakened the dragon. And now, this terrifying dragon, gathering 100,000-strong army of pure vengeance, was descending from the high mountains to personally wipe the last hero of the East off the face of the earth. The ultimate hunt had begun. There was nowhere left to retreat. Ahead lay only the freezing waters of the Indus River. November 1221. Following the devastating split caused by the petty division of a captured stallion, the Khwarazm Shah's army is melting away at a terrifying pace. His crucial Afghan allies have fully deserted, dragging half of his military might away with them. Jalal al-Din is left with a mere 30,000 exhausted warriors and an endless, trailing caravan of panicked refugees. The Khwarazmians are retreating aggressively eastward, desperately hoping to ford the mighty Indus and find a safe haven deep within Indian lands. However, the conqueror of the universe is entirely done playing cat and mouse. Infuriated by the profound shame of Parwan, Genghis Khan personally leads the furious pursuit, bringing with him 50,000 of his absolute best cavalrymen. The nomads of the steppe fly forward, completely forgetting both sleep and rest, aggressively seizing all the commanding heights to definitively drive the fugitives into a dead end. The commander makes the grim decision to fight on the very precipice of doom. He takes up a position that seemingly appears impregnable. His left flank is shielded by sheer, impassable cliffs, while his right is protected by the violent, raging currents of the river. The heir to the throne deeply hoped that this narrow bottleneck would strip the nomads of their favored tactic of sweeping envelopments. However, Genghis Khan had meticulously prepared a deadly surprise, the elite tumen of Bahatars led by Balanoyan. These absolute masters of mountain warfare are fully capable of overcoming any physical obstacle. Then comes the bitter moment of realization. The very cliffs that served as a protective shield now become stepping stones for the assassins. At dawn on November 24th, a thick blanket of fog shrouds the valley. When the white veil finally lifts, the defenders see a terrifying steel crescent standing right before them. The Great Khan's tumens have completely enveloped the camp, pinning it tightly against the water. Genghis Khan is not simply seeking a victory, he is meticulously orchestrating total annihilation. A terrifying order echoes down the Mongol ranks. Take the prince alive and only alive. This specific command inadvertently grants the Khwarazm Shah precious time. The legendary archers of the steppe, whose united volleys could blot out the sun, are terrified of accidentally striking the primary target and are thus forced to close in for brutal hand-to-hand combat. A horrific bloodbath boils over. On this tiny patch of earth, thousands of bodies violently merge into a meat grinder. The commander fights directly in the front ranks. Fully clad in heavy armor, he personally hurls his elite guard into a desperate counterattack right down the center, while the unbreakable Timur Malik holds the flank with the sheer madness of a dead man walking. The Khwarazmian wedge bites into the Mongol formations with such terrifying ferocity that Genghis Khan is momentarily forced to abandon his own command post. But the cold, iron logic of war takes its inevitable toll. While the battle violently boils in the center, Balanoyan's fighters accomplish the absolute impossible. Enduring horrific losses, they scale the sheer mountain ridge and deliver a devastating strike directly into the rear. The defense violently shatters. Renowned military commanders are trampled to death beneath the hooves of war horses, and the only remaining path of escape is the freezing, violent abyss of the Indus. For our hero, the battle rapidly morphs into a deeply personal apocalypse. The encirclement shrinks tighter. Piercing through the deafening clash of steel come the heartbreaking sobs of his own wives and children. In that brutal reality, captivity for a noblewoman promised something far, far worse than death: ignominious slavery and public defilement. "For the sake of Allah, do not give us to the enemy! Kill us here!" echoes from the ruined camp. Just feel the crushing weight of this agonizing choice. A warrior who never once flinched before a terrifying horde is now forced to personally destroy the very people he swore to protect. In that dark era, a fatal strike of mercy from a loved one was perceived as the ultimate final gift of love. Choking on unbearable, soul-crushing pain, the prince orders his own family to be pushed into the furious, raging waves of the Indus. The violent water swallows them whole before the filthy Mongol hands can ever reach them. Nothing binds him to this world anymore. His empire smells of cold ash, his army is dead, his loved ones are gone forever. All that remains is pure, unadulterated fury. Swapping his exhausted horse for a fresh steed and tearing off his heavy armor, he leaves himself with nothing but his blade and his personal standard. The grand exile crashes into the thickest mass of enemies for one final time, transforming into a terrifying whirlwind of absolute destruction. Slicing straight through the wall of steel, he steers his horse right towards the 7-meter cliff. One explosive leap, and the rider completely disappears into the boiling, violent current. Instantly, hundreds of archers materialize on the edge of the cliff. Thousands of deadly arrowheads are aimed directly at the water, where the swimmer appears to be the perfect, helpless target. But suddenly, an authoritative hand shoots up into the air over the battlefield. It is the Great Khan himself. the conqueror of the universe commands his men to cease firing immediately. In absolute ringing silence, he watches as his mortal blood enemy, fighting a desperate battle with death itself, fiercely rows his way to the opposite shore. There, the fugitive stands tall at his full height, violently drives his sword into the earth, and casts one final piercing look at the very men who had stripped him of absolutely everything. The great Khan turns slowly to his own sons, Chagatai, Ogadai, and Jochi, whose endless bickering and petty intrigues were already acting as poison within his empire. In his eyes burns a potent mix of deep fury at their weakness and boundless, genuine respect for the valor of his ultimate adversary. The entire army remains frozen in profound stupor as the Khan silently follows the hero with his gaze. Finally, he shatters the heavy silence. Such is the son a father must have. The brutal clash is over. Jalal al-Din has survived, but his entire world has been utterly destroyed down to its foundations. He stands entirely alone on foreign soil, in soaked garments, possessing absolutely nothing but his faithful sword. Just how will this lone fugitive, stripped of everything he ever knew, manage to resurrect hope and once again hurl a challenge at the men who conquered the world? The Indian shore greeted the surviving prince with dead silence and suffocating, oppressive heat. Having clawed his way out of the boiling whirlpools of the Indus, Jalal al-Din had lost absolutely everything. His family had perished, his grand army was scattered to the winds, and his mighty empire lay trampled beneath the hooves of Mongol war horses. He had genuinely hoped to find a safe sanctuary in India, a quiet haven for a broken exile who had lost his homeland. But reality proved utterly merciless. 13th century Hindustan was boiling with deadly political intrigues, where even the slightest display of weakness guaranteed inevitable, violent death. And it was exactly then that a paradoxical transformation occurred. Fate itself forced the cornered prey to bare its fangs. Simply to survive in a strange land, the fugitive morphed into the most terrifying predator in the entire region. Instead of hiding in the deep jungles, the exile begins to rally the surviving warriors who manage to wash up on the foreign shore. Literally, out of the mud and ashes, he cobbles together a squad, no more than 4,000 completely exhausted men. When a local Raja throws a force of 6,000 fresh, well-armed soldiers against him, the prince doesn't retreat an inch. He personally leads his ragged men into a furious charge and inflicts a completely devastating defeat upon the enemy, instantly multiplying his own martial glory. This stunning triumph acts on local mercenaries like a powerful magnet. Sensing his growing strength, the last Khwarazm Shah formally requests asylum from the Sultan of Delhi, Iltutmish. However, the cunning politician politely but firmly rejects the exile, having absolutely no desire to draw the terrifying wrath of Genghis Khan upon his own lands. Utterly rejected by the Lord of Delhi, the prince turns his predatory gaze toward the exceptionally wealthy lands of Punjab and Sindh. These territories were ruled at the time by Nasir al-Din Qabacha, a deeply peace-loving sovereign whose subjects had long enjoyed tranquility. Jalal al-Din quickly forges an alliance with the Khokhar tribe, the ancient bitter enemies of Qabacha, and violently descends upon his domains. An era of ruthless, unbridled terror begins. The commander shatters the army of the ruler of Sindh near the city of Uch, forcing him to flee for his life. Soon after, he burns a rebellious city straight to the ground and forces the capitulation of the governor of Szechuan, who walks out to the victor wearing a funeral shroud with a bare sword hung around his neck. Moving relentlessly further south, the invaders' army ruthlessly plunders the fabulously wealthy cities of Tata and Debal. Right here lies the greatest, most bitter historical irony. The very man who had watched in sheer horror as the Mongols slaughtered his own people begins to behave in India exactly like Genghis Khan himself. The desperate refugee who had sought mercy now uses fire and sword to grind the prosperous province of Sind into smoldering ruins. This is the ultimate tragedy of a hero who, for the sake of mere survival, transformed into the very evil he had sworn to fight. This dark choice was dictated not by innate sadism, but by the cold, calculating mathematics of war. For his future grand revenge against the Mongols, he required colossal resources, mountains of gold, massive herds of war horses, and tens of thousands of mercenaries. The Sultan ruthlessly beat these resources out of Kabacha, violently demanding an unbearable tribute and snatching high-ranking nobles as hostages. A foreign country was forcefully converted into the financial fuel for his own personal vendetta. Meanwhile, Genghis Khan had certainly not forgotten about his surviving enemy. 2 tumens of elite Mongol troops under the direct command of Dorbe Dukshin were dispatched to hunt down the prince. The nomads of the steppe violently stormed the fortress of Nandana and laid a heavy siege to Multan. But after 40 days of grueling, agonizing warfare, the blistering Indian heat broke even their iron will. The nomads retreated. A critically important lesson was internalized by Jalal al-Din. The demons of the steppe were physically vulnerable, but remaining in India forever meant permanently losing any chance of resurrecting his empire. 3 long, bloody years of wandering and endless battles pass. Soon, long-awaited news arrives from over the mountains. The Sultan's brother, Ghiyath al-Din, had managed to secure a firm foothold in the western remnants of the collapsed state in Iran, and he was urgently calling for his return. In the year 1223, Jalal al-Din abandons the thoroughly pillaged Sind and sets out on his journey back. He must cross the deadly, unforgiving Makran Desert. A massive portion of his newly raised army perishes from unbearable thirst, but the prince, as if magically warded against death itself, bursts through the scorching, fiery sands. He finally steps on the scorched earth of Iran. The rumor of the glorious return of the hero of Parwan flies across Persia faster than the wind itself. The local population, utterly exhausted by the chaos and anarchy, greets him with absolute jubilation, treating him like a messiah. The Sultan swiftly removes his brother from power and with completely unbelievable speed fully restores his iron grip over Kerem, Fars, and Tabriz. The great Khwarazmian Empire rises once again from the dead ashes. The outcast prince once again possesses a golden throne and a fiercely loyal army, heavily tempered in the bloody meat grinders of India. A crystal-clear task stands before him. He must demonstrate profound diplomatic wisdom, forge a massive, united coalition of Islamic rulers and Georgian kings, and prepare to meet the inevitable return of the great Khan with a single, unbreakable front of steel. But Jalal al-Din makes a decision that will cause the entire inhabited world to shudder in horror. A decision that will permanently transform the last hero of the East into the sworn enemy of all mankind. In the next module, we will witness exactly how this brilliant commander used his own 2 hands to utterly destroy every single one of his potential allies. An empire reborn from the ashes laid completely at Jalal al-Din's feet. Having furiously reconquered the western Iranian lands, the exiled prince achieved the absolutely impossible. He had reclaimed his throne, his army, and his grand status as the supreme lord of the East. The general populace, exhausted by endless bloodshed and anarchy, genuinely saw him as a divine savior, while the rulers of neighboring states watched the rapid resurrection of the Khwarazmian state with deep, gnawing anxiety. A single, perfectly reasonable path lay out before the hero. He needed to display diplomatic flexibility, cast aside ancient grievances, and forge a massive, unbreakable anti-Mongol alliance. Islamic emirs, Georgian kings, and even Syrian crusaders lived in absolute terror of the nomad's return. Jalal al-Din could have served as the grand shield of Eurasia, unifying these fractured, desperate forces into a single, mighty fist. Instead, he actively chooses the path of total, unbridled war against absolutely everyone at once. The ruler's profound political blindness manifested perfectly in his correspondence with the Georgian queen, Rusudan. Georgia possessed a formidable, highly respected army and could have become an invaluable ally. However, Jalal al-Din arrogantly demands not support from the queen, but her complete and absolute enslavement. Rusudan's response strikes back like a brutal slap to the face. The proud, unyielding ruler openly mocks the Khwarazm Shah, caustically reminding him of his deeply shameful flight to India to escape the wrath of Genghis Khan. These stinging words cut the prince to the very bone. Utterly enraged, Jalal al-Din gathers a 100,000-strong army, violently summons Turkmens and mercenaries under his banners, and invades the Trans-Caucasus. Autumn 1225. The Battle of Garni completely annihilates the very backbone of the Georgian military forces. The defenders' vanguard is utterly crushed, and their top military commanders are captured. The road to Tbilisi lies completely open. Queen Rusudan hastily abandons her capital, taking refuge in Kutaisi and throwing the grand city to the sheer mercy of fate. On March 9, 1226, the defense of Tbilisi violently collapses. With the active help of local collaborators, the Khwarezmians burst into the narrow, winding streets. The subsequent events terrify even his contemporaries, who were already well accustomed to extreme brutality. The Khwarazm Shah does not merely limit himself to standard pillaging. He unleashes a highly sophisticated, sadistic campaign of religious terror, explicitly ordering the Grand Dome to be torn down from the Sioni Cathedral, the city's primary Christian shrine. On that very spot, carpenters construct a gigantic, towering platform for his royal throne. The sovereign sits proudly atop the desecrated temple, coldly watching the horrific massacre from on high. By his direct will, holy icons of Christ and the Virgin Mary are dragged out of the cathedral and violently thrown onto the wooden decking of the bridge over the Kura River. Every single citizen of the city is forcefully driven to the crossing, where they are violently commanded to trample the holy relics and formally renounce Christ. Those who bravely refuse are executed right on the spot. Georgian chroniclers recall the brutal slaughter of innocent children and the elderly with profound, shaking horror. In those terrifying, blood-soaked days, roughly 100,000 Christians fell, the equivalent of the entire population of the largest European capitals of that era. The tragic irony is glaringly obvious. Jalal al-Din genuinely believed that extreme, unrestrained cruelty would prove his supreme greatness and force his neighbors into submission. In reality, he was aggressively burning his very last bridges to any negotiation, rapidly transforming potential friends into mortal, sworn enemies. The ultimate victim of Mongol terror had himself become a horrifying monster, perfectly copying the brutal habits of Genghis Khan. The complete devastation of Georgia did not quench his burning thirst for power. Leaving the smoldering ashes of Tbilisi behind him, he marches his massive army west, violently invading Armenia and the sovereign lands of the Seljuks. The Khwarazm Shah captures the critical, heavily fortified city of Akhlat, tearing it away from the Ayyubid dynasty. His reckless actions cross absolutely every conceivable boundary. The Islamic world, though exhausted by endless internal strife, finally finds the strength to unite against him. Christians and Muslims, the Seljuk Sultan Keykubat I and the Syrian ruler al-Ashraf completely forget their ancient feuds. They forge a massive, highly motivated coalition for one single purpose: to stop the crazed Khwarazm Shah at all costs. The former exile had actively provoked his very own kind of crusade against himself. August 1230. The Battle of Yassi-Chamen. Jalal al-Din commands his troops from a high, commanding hill. The Khwarazmians fight with the terrifying fury of the doomed. The first day fails to reveal a clear victor, but at the break of dawn, fresh, elite Mamluks of al-Ashraf arrive to reinforce the Seljuks. The sheer numerical superiority of the allied forces shatters the Khwarazmian lines. Watching the total collapse of his flanks, the Sultan fully comprehends the sheer scale of the catastrophe. The Grand Army, painstakingly gathered piece by piece in the burning Indian sands and the rugged Persian mountains, is completely annihilated. The last hero of the East runs for his life once again, seeking refuge in Diyarbakir. Why did such a brilliant military commander suffer such an absolute political fiasco? His actions were entirely dictated by the deep trauma of a colossal loss. Having lost his grand home, he desperately tried to recreate Khwarazm in miniature, aggressively demanding slavish submission from sovereign rulers. He utterly refused to engage in dialogue as an equal. He fundamentally failed to understand that in exile, the grand status of a monarch is completely useless without a secure rear and fiercely loyal allies. His boundless pride had slaughtered his own army. While Jalal al-Din pointlessly squandered his strength in meaningless, endless wars, the very shadow he feared most had finally awakened in the east. The Mongol Empire had fully stabilized after the death of Genghis Khan. The new great Khan, Odegi, having restored iron order to his father's vast inheritance, turned his gaze westward. Upon learning of the miraculous return of the elusive, unkillable prince, Odegi issued a highly laconic command. General Chorma Khan marched against the Khwarazm Shah. 3 tumens, 30,000 heavily hardened veterans who knew absolutely no pity. The trap slammed shut. Left entirely without troops, without support, and without honor, Jalal al-Din found himself standing completely face to face with the inescapable avalanche of the steppe. The year 1231. The air over Iran grows thick with the choking dust kicked up by tens of thousands of hooves. The new, terrifying wave of conquerors pouring into the Middle East by the absolute will of Ogedei Khan differs drastically from the exhausted detachments of the past. These are 30,000 highly hardened veterans under the command of General Chorma Khan. Heavily armored riders move with one single unified purpose: to finish the job that Genghis Khan himself had started. At this intensely critical moment, history drives a brutal dagger straight into the Khwarazm Shah's back. Utterly exhausted by Jalal al-Din's chaotic unpredictability, the most sinister force in the East moves against him: the Order of Assassins. The lord of the fortress of Alamut dispatches a highly secret message to Ogedei, directly offering the Mongols a lethal alliance against the last prince of Khwarazm. The trap slams entirely shut. yesterday's self-proclaimed defender of Islam finds himself utterly betrayed by his own co-religionists. For Jalal al-Din, the time of ultimate catastrophe has arrived. His grand army, meticulously gathered piece by piece in the sands of India and the highlands of Persia, completely vanished after the devastating defeat by the Seljuks at Yasychenen. His finest generals are dead. His royal treasury is completely empty. Upon hearing of the rapid approach of Chormakhan's tumens, the Sultan frantically tries to rally forces, but his commands simply vanish into the void. There is absolutely no one left to fight. The final, most profoundly humiliating hunt begins. The Mongol steppe tactic of the Great Batu deprives the prey of any space to breathe. The invaders do not bother storming city walls. They simply drive their prey, methodically cutting off every possible route of escape. Abandoning his camp and the meager remnants of his possessions to the enemy, the prince flees desperately to the west, toward Diyarbakir. He is no longer surrounded by fiercely loyal legions. The Lord of the East has been reduced to a cornered, panicked wolf, darting frantically through the harsh, unforgiving mountains of Kurdistan. August 1231. The Sylvan Mountains. The exhausting, blistering heat gives way to a piercing, bone-chilling night cold. Just picture this profound scene. No golden royal tents, no luxurious silk pillows of Gurganj. A deeply ragged man, his face sharply hollowed out by starvation, finds pathetic shelter inside a wretched, squalid hut. He unbuckles his heavy weapons and collapses into a deep, feverish sleep. A silent shadow creeps softly toward the campsite. This is no elite saboteur of the Golden Horde, nor is it a highly trained, dispatched killer from Alamut. Before us stands an ordinary, poor Kurdish Highlander. Historical chronicles fiercely debate his true motives. Perhaps he was exacting blood revenge for a brother murdered by the Khwarazmians during the brutal sack of the city of Akhlat. Or perhaps the truth was far more prosaic. A destitute beggar saw an exhausted, sleeping stranger dressed in sturdy clothing with a highly valuable blade strapped to his belt. The bandit raises his hand. A single thrust of a spear abruptly severs the life of the mighty sultan. A monstrous, ringing irony echoes through this death. Jalal al-Din genuinely believed he was born for the ultimate, greatest battle, that his grand destiny was to fall with a sword tightly gripped in his hands before the eyes of a deeply stunned world. But reality proved infinitely more merciless. The brilliant tactical genius who had effortlessly dodged terrifying storms of arrows and survived the apocalyptic meat grinder on the banks of the Indus, quietly choked on his own blood in nameless, forgotten mud. The conqueror of the universe could not break him with the combined might of his entire horde, yet a random, opportunistic robber stabbed the sole savior of Asia to death simply for a worn-out kaftan. The very next morning, the peasant walked away down a mountain trail, casually carrying the blood-stained garment of the Sultan, completely unaware that he had just drastically altered the course of human history. The Khwarazmian Empire definitively vanished into oblivion. The surviving local emirs instantly tore each other to pieces fighting over the shattered remnants of the territories, becoming incredibly easy prey for Chormakhan's advancing forces. The prince's young daughter, little Turkhan, was taken captive and raised within the grand courts of the Mongol Khans. Later, Hulagu Khan would marry her off to the governor of Mosul, putting a final, definitive end to the royal dynasty's history. The surviving Khwarazmian warriors, now entirely stripped of a master, transformed into brutal, wandering mercenaries. This fiercely savage horde, having permanently lost its homeland, would go on to relentlessly terrorize the Middle East for decades. It was exactly they who in the year 1244 would violently storm Jerusalem, directly triggering the Seventh Crusade. But the death of Jalal al-Din himself was so absurdly anticlimactic that the East simply refused to believe it. The grand legend of the hero gave birth to wandering ghosts. Whispered rumors began to crawl through the caravanserai, claiming that the prince had miraculously survived, traded his heavy armor for the ragged cloak of a Sufi dervish, and was now wandering the world in absolute secrecy, praying for the forgiveness of his many sins. This belief ran so incredibly deep that for the next 30 years, the empire was violently rocked by the endless uprisings of impostors. In 1236, a miraculously saved sultan suddenly appeared in Mazandaran, leading a massive rebellion that the Mongols had to crush with exceptional brutality. Even decades later, men actively being tortured to death continued to defiantly call themselves by the name of the fallen Khwarazm Shah. The terrifying shadow of the last hero frightened the invaders for generations. Jalal al-Din Mongol suffered complete and utter collapse as a political ruler, but he achieved absolute, eternal victory as a grand myth, forever remaining the ultimate symbol of unyielding resistance. The final prince of Khwarazm is dead. The body of Jalal al-Din Mongol, covered in a blood-soaked rag, has vanished forever within the rocky labyrinths of the Kurdish gorges. It is right here that history reveals its most utterly merciless paradox. The absolute genius of tactics, who shattered elite Mongol tumens on the field of battle, single-handedly lost the war for the survival of his own nation. His heart blazed with the raw courage of an enraged lion, but his mind never managed to acquire the profound wisdom of a true statesman. Let us analyze his grand journey. The prince genuinely believed pure fear and brute force would force his neighbors to bow, forging a living, breathing shield against the advancing horde. In stark reality, his uncompromising brutality, the horrific devastation of Tbilisi, and his unprovoked aggression against the Seljuks successfully united both Christians and Muslims against him alone. Fate played a deeply cruel joke. A man who lost his beloved homeland to Mongol terror transformed while in exile into a terrifying monster himself, perfectly copying the savage methods of the invaders, yet entirely lacking their brilliant strategic genius. While securing dozens of local tactical victories, he ultimately isolated himself in an absolute political vacuum, completely stripping the Middle East of its one true chance for salvation. His profoundly tragic finale teaches us a vital lesson, deeply relevant even in the 21st century. We have a natural tendency to deeply admire lone wolf heroes and audacious, reckless rebels. Jalal al-Din perfectly embodied the powerful archetype of the unyielding wolf. However, harsh reality proves lone wolves do not build lasting empires, and they certainly do not save entire civilizations. Personalities like his flare up with blinding brightness, only to rapidly and inevitably burn themselves straight down to ashes. In the grand game of history, where the lives of millions are placed on the line, mere battlefield valor and masterful swordplay are catastrophically insufficient. Genuine, lasting greatness often hides in the exhausting, tedious work of a diplomat. the rare ability to tame one's own raging ego, to forgive ancient, bitter grievances, and to carefully forge alliances, consistently proves far more reliable than the thickest armor of Damascus steel. Genghis Khan conquered the entire world not just through the ruthless efficiency of his troops, but through his incredibly rare talent for transforming yesterday's mortal enemies into fiercely loyal generals. The Sultan, conversely, while demonstrating the raw physical courage of 1,000 warriors, suffered from the sheer diplomatic blindness of a capricious teenager. Waging war against absolutely everyone inevitably leads to total collapse. Let our imagination touch the rocky, jagged shores of the Indus River for one final time. The grand river still carries its dark, heavy waters through the stones with complete indifference. But now, only the silent phantom of the last ruler wanders these banks. The glinting steel of Mongol archers no longer flashes atop a high cliff. The wind has long since scattered the deafening echoes of the war horns, and both the heavy armor and the colossal empire of the Khwarazm Shahs have crumbled into fine dust, becoming nothing more than dry, faded lines in ancient chronicles. Only the legend has survived. The grand story of a man whose desperate, explosive leap from a 7-meter cliff into a roaring abyss became far more monumental and majestic than the entirety of his subsequent life. Jalal al-Din tore across the skies of Asia like a highly destructive meteor, blinding his contemporaries with his furious, unbridled valor, only to shatter into utterly useless fragments inside a filthy, forgotten mountain cave at the very end. With this episode, we formally conclude our massive series on the devastating fall of the Great Khwarazm. We have meticulously traced the anatomy of a truly continental catastrophe. We saw how the boundless greed of the governor Inalchuk fully awakened the sleeping dragon, how the paralyzing, suffocating fear of Muhammad II completely decapitated a giant army, how the overwhelming pride of the serpent queen Terken Khatun burned a mighty state from the inside out, and exactly how the utter desperation of the last prince morphed into a deadly double-edged sword that ultimately destroyed its own master. Greed, paralyzing fear, and unbridled pride wiped a magnificent, flourishing civilization entirely off the face of the earth. But the steel Mongol machine did not hit the brakes. It simply continued to violently grind through space and time as it relentlessly rolled toward the west. Throughout this entire series, we have walked waist-deep through thick smoke and cold ash. But long before it violently perished in the roaring flames of invasion, Khwarazm was the absolute greatest superpower of the East, drowning in profound science and beautiful poetry. Its mighty rulers casually swept away rival kingdoms, erected magnificent palaces, and forced the grand caliphs of Baghdad to tremble in sheer terror. Do you want to see the completely different side of this story? If you are eager to learn not about the devastating fall, but about the grand meteoric rise, the absolute power, and the golden age of this magnificent empire, type the word Khwarazm down in the comments. Your direct response will completely decide whether we return to the very origins of this brilliant civilization in our upcoming episodes. Make sure to absolutely subscribe to the channel and hit that like button if the profound tragedy of the last hero of the East forced you to take a completely different look at the true nature of power. You've been watching Chronicles of the Great. We shed bright light upon the darkest shadows of the past so that you can see the present with absolute clarity. Until we meet again in the winding labyrinths of history.